Hi, I'm Willie Edwards. Some of you become familiar with me. This is the textbook that we'll be using for this class, the Criminal Justice Policy by Mears. And so hopefully you've already begun reading some of that, and we won't have to worry about that. Okay, so let's get started. Try to enjoy this interaction. Okay, in this class, the CJ 583 Criminal Justice Policy, we will work to understand how policies are developed, how they're created, and how they are implemented, and how they're evaluated. This class will allow us to put into practice some of the things, information that we've learned in our other classes, such as the criminological theories. Hopefully you haven't forgotten about that one. Correction class, the policing and issues and courts and criminal law classes. So we're going to use some of that information now as we look at criminal justice policies. As suggested by our textbook author, Professor Mears, knowing something about criminological theories helps us to evaluate, to develop, and to come up with policies that deal with various aspects of the criminal justice system, or at the least, those who commit criminal or illegal acts. So we can deal with those individuals throughout the policies that we develop. The author of the textbook we're using focuses on criminal justice policies, uses criminal justice examples, and identifies how evaluation research questions must be tailored to fit specific criminal justice policies. And that's going to be good because we need to ask the questions, we need to ask the right questions so that we can have the right policies implemented. Our author believes that evaluation research should provide important information about such questions as whether to adapt or abandon a policy and how to design or improve policies. The idea, that is the IDEAL, situation is that our professional research, theories, academic, practical knowledge guide the making of our criminal justice policies. So all of that information, all of those areas are important for us. However, we know that criminal justice officials, the administrators, the practitioners, the researchers, and students have limited training in policy evaluation. So, with this class, we plan to develop some skills in criminal justice policy. We plan to use implementation and understand how evaluation is done. Our author says that we are at the crossroads in terms of accountability and reliance on evidence-based strategies that we can improve criminal justice policies. He says that we can improve our cost effectiveness, reduce crimes, help offenders become contributing members of society, assist victims, families, and communities affected by crime. So what we're going to do now is kind of thumb through Chapter 1 and Chapter 2 for our first video here. So Professor Mears suggests that by applying an evaluation research framework to the most prominent criminal justice policies, that two patterns of importance have been recognized. Number one, he says, is that there is not a systematic evidence-based foundation for much of our criminal justice policies. He says this, he shows this as we move through some of the chapters as we evaluate some of the policies that now exist. Number two, he says, opportunities exist for increasing the accountability and effectiveness of criminal justice policies. So by gaining more information, learning how to evaluate, we should be able to make better policies, or at least influence those who help make and create those policies. The goal of the textbook, or goals eventually, which assists the class in meeting the student learning objectives, is to show how evaluation research can be used to contribute to efforts by policymakers, criminal justice officials and practitioners, researchers, students, and the public at large to improve criminal justice policies. A second goal of the textbook is to make the argument that many prominent criminal justice policies lack a solid evidence-based foundation. And he says that on page 4, and you'll see that throughout the book. He is critical of the policies that exist. Now, that's not a bad thing. That's a good thing. A third and final goal of the book is to make the case that evaluation research should be integrated into criminal justice policies, making and practice. Okay, so that's really the sum of Chapter 1, not a lot in Chapter 1, but in Chapter 2 he becomes a little bit more deep. And so let's see what we have and want you to key in on as you read Chapter 2. Chapter 2 is the irrational criminal justice policy. In Chapter 2, the author starts out declaring that using evaluation research can lead to less bad policies and more good policies. He says ultimately that such work, in other words, evaluation research, can place criminal justice policies on a more rational footing. In Chapter 2, the author sets the stage by laying out the steps in evaluation research. And each chapter after that will deal with a specific part of evaluation research and the process of finding out if criminal justice policies are being effective. So he'll lay out the steps, and in each succeeding chapter, then we'll see each one of those areas covered. In Chapter 2, we have the following being accomplished. Introduction to the evaluation hierarchy as a framework for critiquing current policy. 2, provide a portrait of national crime justice system trends. 3, describe some of the prominent factors that have influenced criminal justice policies. The evaluation hierarchy is presented on page 10 of the textbook, and each of these steps will become a chapter in the book. So the steps are as follows. 1, need evaluation. He says, is there a need for a policy? Should a policy be established? What should the policy be about? Number 2, theory evaluation. Is the policy grounded in a clear and well-established theory? 3, implementation process evaluation. Is implementation of the policy consistent with this theory or design? Perhaps another way of saying this is, does the policy allow the problem or condition to really be addressed and dealt with? Number 4, he says, outcome and impact evaluation. Does the policy achieve the intended outcome? Based on the end result, is this what the policy and especially the implementation of the policy expected to be the outcome? In other words, what's the result? Is this what we really wanted or expected to happen? Is the result impactful? Does it work? And is that what we would want to happen? Number 5, cost efficiency evaluation. Does the policy achieve the desired effects in a cost-effective manner? Does the cost of the implementation and the fulfilling of the policy outweigh the benefits? Those are going to be important as we move through the textbook. Again, there are 2 types of cost efficiency evaluation. One is cost effectiveness analysis, and this compares the cost of 2 or more policies aimed at achieving the same goal. That's 2 or more policies. The other one is cost benefit analysis. It compares the cost and benefits of 2 or more policies that have different goals. In other words, which would be the cheapest or the cheaper of a policy to implement. Okay? Each type of evaluation task asks a question. And if those questions are not adequately answered, then there's a problem with the policy and its implementation. Professor Mears says that many of the nation's most prominent criminal justice policies lack a solid theoretical and empirical foundation, and that the necessary ingredients for holding the criminal justice system accountable and making it effective do not yet exist. In this chapter, the author briefly talked about the types of crime and crime rate. Now, most of us are familiar with this, especially those of you who are in the criminal justice field. The Uniform Crime Report, that, and then the National Incident-Based Report, both of those items or documents are produced by the FBI. Then you have the National Crime Victimization Survey, the NCVS. Sounds really serious here, okay? That is done by the Bureau of Justice Statistics. And then one that he does not mention is the self-reported studies. That's done mostly by researchers, okay? The crime rate has been declining over the last several years. The author did not really address the reason for this decline. However, all criminologists can give you some reason for this decline. And probably in most of your classes, you've heard that. You understand the reason why that is now. All right? This class will not focus on that. Okay? The author briefly mentioned the growth in the correctional, and that is in the institutional division system. He talks about prison somewhat. He says that the result of that growth is out of a get tough policy. He mentioned prisoners' reentry because we know that prisoners eventually get out of prison. He addresses the cycle of recidivism. We have policies to address all of these areas or occurrences. He talks and he points out the large expenditure associated with the criminal justice system and especially cost of imprisonment. For example, Mears says that from 1982 to 2006, the expenditures increased by 500%, from $36 billion to $215 billion, a large increase, I would think. Mears says that too little research exists to support the selection and continued support of many of our criminal justice policies. He believes most criminal justice policies lack a strong empirical foundation. That goes back to that theory grounding, that research-oriented, providing information for policymakers in order to create a good policy. And we'll talk about that a little bit later on. In this chapter 2, the author addresses an area known as the influences on criminal justice policy. In this area, he states, there is seemingly a large disjuncture between calls for accountability and evidence-based policy, and the realization of these calls through the research base necessary to have accountability or to identify evidence-based policies that are effective and cost-efficient. Well, now, if I lost you in all of that, that's on page 20, and you can look at that, and we'll think a little bit about that. We'll talk about that probably during one of our discussions, okay? One prominent explanation for why criminal justice policies emerge is politicalization. Mears states that politicalization of crime has featured prominently in many compelling accounts of crime policies. Handling crime per se increases the electability of politicians. We all know that. That's nothing secret or scientific about it, or it's no rocket science there, right? Little political fallout occurs when policymakers focus on criminals. Failure to establish a record of being tough on criminals can substantially limit a policymaker's career. Short career is what we find out. Another influence he talks about in the textbook is the development and the implementation of criminal justice policies. He talks about how those deal with the complexity of many of our crime problems, but how they also have to be simplified for the public consumption or understanding. So we realize that problems have lots of complexity, but how do you get the public to understanding? You have to kind of drum it down, simplify it. That's what he's saying. Mears says that this causes an oversimplified distillation, where there is either X way of doing something or Y way. He says one or the other, not both or not a combination of. One example he shares in the book is rehabilitation versus punishment. To some extent, policymakers and the public sees nothing in between. You are either tough on crime or you're easy on crime. Mears also addresses the swinging from one extreme to the other. And so you'll see all of these in the book, as he mentioned, as they influence the development of policies. He says that the country's crime policy approaches have changed dramatically from one era to the next. And most recently transitioning, he says, away from rehabilitation-oriented crime prevention approaches that prevailed in the 1960s and the 1970s, and the movement towards more punishment-oriented approaches that have prevailed since that time. He also says that, for instance, juvenile justice tends to cycle back and forth between lenient policies and harsh, punitive policies. He cites that the transition frequently occurs with little or no assessment of the precise problems, the effectiveness of the current set of policies, or the best mix of strategies for addressing crime and improving criminal justice operations. So we'll see a number of that as we move through the chapter. The author mentions that in some instances, bad cases make for bad laws. He describes how policymakers attempt to respond to the public while also meeting the criticism and the investigative eye of the media. These dynamics make sure that sensational cases or activities become the drive behind criminal justice policies, and that they appear to be the everyday situation, but they are not. I won't even talk about the Hardin Williams case. You remember, I think, President Nixon, the daddy, okay, talked about. Those kinds of situations, yes. A silver bullet is another area he talks about. A silver bullet solution can cause problems with establishing of criminal justice policies. Mears mentioned that some policies take a single-minded focus towards reducing crime. He uses as an example the drug problem within our society. The focus on drugs appears to be fueled by the belief that illegal drug use causes crime, and that it does so in a dramatic way. Notably, however, it remains unclear how strong the relationship between individual drug use and offending is, and whether the relationship is actual causal, or is a causal relationship. You do remember, you do understand the difference between causal and association. Well, we'll talk about that too. What he suggests ought to occur is a diversified portfolio approach, not a silver bullet approach to fighting crime. And again, he says a diversified portfolio, which is on page 29. In a final presentation in chapter 2, Mears identifies 5 areas where he says a lack of contribution from research has served as the barrier to better policies. 5 of these areas, and so we'll look at those and see. The question he proposed and answered was, why has research had relatively little influence on policy. Number one would be a lack of institutionalized foundations for systematically integrating evaluation of research into decisions about criminal justice policy. In other words, there's really not a lot of evaluation research that's done that would help to influence those who make the policies. And of course, those who make the policies then sometimes don't read the research too. So, number two he talks about is policy evaluation research, what sometimes get referred to as applied research because of the focus on applying research to policy. And traditionally, he says that gets kind of short-shifted. It doesn't work very well because lots of universities don't spend money into that kind of research or on that kind of research. Okay? So we'll talk about those too. There we go again. There's a limited, number three would be there's a limited funding for criminal justice and crime policies. We know overall then that there's very small amount of money that's given to criminal justice funding, research type. And so that's also a very serious problem. Number four, he says, is the relatively lack of investment in high-quality impact evaluation that rely on experiential design or experimental designs. And that is, we don't do lots of research, we don't do lots of experimental designs in criminology, in sociology. That's more psych kind of stuff. And so he says that because we don't do that, then sometimes we run into problems when we do develop or help to assist in developing policies. The last one he has is the researchers frequently focus their attention on the problem and policies that policymakers emphasize or that constitute the hot topics of the day. So in other words, those stories, those activities, those conditions that are really drawing lots of attention are probably the ones that the policies or the research evaluation actually is done on, not some of the mundane, maybe some of the very basic problems that exist. Well, let me say this. These are our first two chapters in Mears' book. Again, we will focus on criminal justice policies in terms of developing, implementing, and evaluating them. I hope by now that you have a rather good insight into what we will be covering in this chapter.